Welcome, and I thank Misano and Gustavo for this new chance to meet and reflect on such an important subject. This evening, if I am able to, I would like to report on and tell you about a hope. But I'm under no illusions. We call this evening's talk Flowers Blooming in the Desert. And this means that the desert is already present and is increasing. There is no passionate or strong sense of community. We'll try to understand why, but we can already say that there is no passionate sense of community because there is no longer a community. There's no longer any civilization in a certain sense. On the other hand, our cities, which gave birth to our community and civilization, our citizens, and therefore our sense of community, have no longer existed for some time. Our cities are urban agglomerations and are not places endowed with, let's say, an urban or architectural order. I remember Norbert Schulz, the great urban architect, whom I met at the end of the 80s, and he was asking me, but where is Rome? Where does Rome begin? A person goes to Rome and he or she cannot say, well, Rome begins at this perimeter here. Instead, at a certain point, while crossing through often ugly streets full of badly constructed buildings, at a certain point there is a street sign, Rome. There's no arrival point. There is no perimeter. There's no city. There's no order. It's without order. There's no interior or exterior. As a result, it's normal that the city's sense of community, is in a state of deep crisis. From this point of view, we are in a desert. Cities, especially from the 20th century onwards, have often been described as a desert or a jungle, an urban jungle. What is meant by this metaphor? It means that there is no longer a city, it's no longer a place of culture, a place with a sense of order. It's become a jungle. All that disorganized nature that we kept out by building the walls of the city to protect the city from all those dangers, wild beasts, enemies. All those walls have collapsed, and all these problems are now sprouting inside. Therefore, the desert is growing, but as Saint-Exupéry said, what makes a desert beautiful is that somewhere within it, a well is hidden. And the hope we're reflecting on is exactly that. It's time to go hunting for a well. Earlier, we listened to a humorous sentence by the American cosmologist and philosopher Brian Swimme, who says that the real vision of the world that prevails in our society, putting aside all the chit-chat, religious rhetoric, and values, the real values universally accepted by our society, says Brian Swimme, are those dictated by advertising. It's advertising that shapes our vision of the world, which is the most short-sighted vision of the world that can be imagined, the more selfish and anti-social. This is the vision of our world that predominates today. Our ideal, remembering that Swimme is speaking in a joking manner, our ideal person is somebody who swills down Pepsi whilst being very careful to save to the utmost on his or her smartphone or bank accounts. Therefore, we must take care of this. All day long, we are besieged by continual phone calls, right? At least I am, and I think you are too, by mobile phone providers who are continually telling us that we can spend 2 cents less, 3 cents less, and how many calls do we make? And this is what we have to take care of. These are the important things with all their thousands of variations. There is actually a very cute TV commercial that you may recall because it goes on the air that says the great questions have changed. They have changed. We see this girl, right? Beforehand, she was dreaming like this, looking up into the sky and asking if there are other intelligent beings in the universe. Then it's as though she awakens, she becomes a bit grim-faced, changes her expression and says, "But why must I pay something to have a bank account?" The great questions have changed. They have changed. And do you still want to ask questions like, "But what the hell am I doing here on Earth?" Do you still want to ask questions like this? Are you crazy? You are behind the times. You are not up to date, right? The great questions have changed. We're no longer interested in whether there are intelligent beings in the universe, if we're simply a very bizarre animal species that moves around on this earth, organizing these totally useless meetings instead of going to feed ourselves, to eat from the throat like all the other animals, to reproduce freely, copulating how we want, when we want, where we want, and with whom we want. Instead of doing this, which would be the most sensible thing, here we are on Friday evening with Gustavo Cecchini to reflect on having a passionate sense of community. So do you want to ask these questions? You're wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. Soon, this will be forbidden. Holding these meetings will be forbidden. Gustavo will be arrested. Nowadays, a society, we're laughing at ourselves, and that's good to do because we need to get to the point, we will get to the point of poking fun at all this. Don't worry. There are cycles, maybe lasting centuries, but then they come to an end. Eventually, the foolish people, the idiots, are exterminated at their own ends and by their own minds. Is that clear? We need patience, perseverance. We need the resolve of a noble person. Not the nobility due to birthright, the human nobility that is completely fading away. We no longer meet such people. We need to become so ourselves. Now, a society that is founded on these parameters, namely on the most short-sighted and infantile selfishness of our immediate satisfaction, of our many different and absurd desires, a society like this cannot build meaningful and lasting human relations. It can't do it. It can break them down, progressively break them down. Therefore, a society of this kind cannot procreate neither art, nor politics, nor law, or even an economy that is not ever more firmly enslaved by the aims of the global marketplace. As a result, all human relationships, all relationships in society, those relationships that a society organizes within itself, namely marriage, friendship, national gatherings, business gatherings, all these human relationships must necessarily submit to these laws of the market that have become totalitarian. Everything is swallowed up. If the economy is not kept in its proper position as a service, as Benedetto Croce already said, it ends up destroying these other values. The economy must not be put on the same level as ethics and aesthetics. It must not be put on the same level, because if that happens, it will swallow them up, take over and destroy them. In this way, our society is effectively dissolving all uncivilized ties. We must speak out about this. We can't be surprised at the regional and local effects of this local phenomenon. We cannot complain that work is being treated as a commodity. Everything is treated as a commodity and therefore devoid of a free and independent meaning, namely a human one. In a sense, it is the very shape of civilization. What is civilization? Civilization is actually a world of relationships, a historical world in which humans organize their relationships on the basis of their founding values. So, in a society of this kind, what is liquidated is precisely the fundamental form of civilization, and therefore, the point where I wish to begin is simple. Our world is literally uncivilized. Uncivilized. It's far from having any passionate sense of community. In an uncivilized world, there can be no passionate sense of community. The problem is not about having a passionate sense of community or not having it. The problem goes back farther. Are we living in a world where it's still possible to have a passionate sense of community? Are we in a world where human relationships still can have an independent meaning, free from the mechanism of the market, of advertising, of the world view that this represents? Paul Valéry wrote, "Human beings in the great cities are reverting to a wild state, a state of isolation." And I would say isolation on the one hand and molecular wars on the other. Watch the news this evening. The cities are becoming places of confrontation between poor people, uncivilized clashes, in an uncivilized situation determined by an uncivilized logic. All this produces uncivilized situations. The last book by the greatest French and possibly also European sociologist, Alain Touraine, is called La fin des sociétés, the end of society. Touraine, as a great sociologist and historian of society, argues that nowadays a society no longer exists in the sense we were speaking about. There is only an absolute economic power that controls, and it controls more and more rigidly, even the very conscience of individuals, who are reduced, as Foucault already said, to people who can be calculated. We are all becoming calculable people. A brief quotation helps us to better understand this point. And it too is by a sociologist and economist whom I love to quote, Jeremy Rifkin, who writes, "We are making the transition into what economists call an experience economy, a world in which each person's own life becomes, in effect, a commercial market." In business circles, the new operative term is the lifetime value, LTV, of the customer. The theoretical measure of how much a human being is worth if every moment of his or her life were to be commodified in one form or another in the commercial sphere. We are already calculated in this way. Each of us already has our own lifetime value prospectus with social networks that know very well our likes, what we buy, what we like. And on Facebook, all of us naively inform them of our likes, of our friendships. They will convince us to put a microchip on our forehead for the safety of our health. And we will all go around with this microchip, so we will be always connected. What a beauty! What a beauty! What a beauty! We'll be connected. With who? That's not clear. But we'll be connected. We're already connected. They're doing the calculations. Do you hear that? He is not an apocalyptic madman like me. He is an American economist, an advisor to presidents. They calculate our lifetime value. In the new era, people will purchase their lives in tiny segments, each with a commercial value. Do you understand me? Do we want to talk about having a passionate sense of community? Then we'll talk about it. Let's see what and how this is possible in this situation, what it means, what it can mean. Now, however, this system of the world, guys, this system of the world, which, to quote Heidegger, is a known world, because it is a known cosmos, a known society, a known civilization that would like to build on a non-humanity, on a process of dehumanization. I don't know if I am crazy or if I am sane, but to me the process of dehumanization seems deezing fast. Deezing. Not from decade to decade, but from semester to semester. But let me repeat, this world system, from the viewpoint of these analyses like Rifkin's, is also actually collapsing. It's not doing very well, is it? In my view, it is collapsing because essentially it is built on a lie, on a mistaken and false view of mankind's destiny, of the tasks and aims of human life. Therefore, as a result of being founded upon and rooted in a huge lie, it can only produce lies, and lies will eventually collapse. Sooner or later, they will collapse. Again, Rifkin, who has studied very closely from an economic point of view what is now the universal language used to make ourselves understood, if not, we wouldn't be credible. He writes, "The global crisis that is beginning to affect our civilization forces us to ask ourselves if we haven't already reached a turning point in the history of mankind, at least as that has been defined since the advent of the great agricultural and hydraulic civilizations, the turning point of the Neolithic irrigation that opens the way for agriculture and cities, that marked the birth of historical consciousness. So perhaps, says Rifkin, we are still at a turning point." So from here, we will take a few small steps, 5 or 6, to ask ourselves in a brief but well-founded way if it is possible to seriously think about getting out of this situation of worldwide incivility, of the desertification of civilization, to direct ourselves towards new forms of human relationships and then give life, albeit laboriously, slowly, but also with an acceleration that is prompted by the urgency of time, to new embryos of civilization.
Sono più alla moda.
So, small, brief steps as far as possible. Then, as always, if there are questions, we can answer them. But as you know, I like to go to the root of the questions, and the root implies an overview, a thorough overview. So we'll listen to the first point. Rifkin says that in reality, this turning point at which we find ourselves is not only about modern time, but about very broad cycles of history. He even refers to the entire historical cycle that begins with a turning point of the Neolithic, hence with the birth of what we call civilizations. We are at a critical point in the whole cycle. And on this, I would like to read a short sentence by Ernesto Balducci that clearly condemns it. In the ethnological history of all mankind, the modern world is the last phase of that revolution, moving from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic that took place about 10,000 years ago in the area that stretches from Greece to Iran. The constitutive principle of that project from the beginning was the dominion of mankind over nature. The ecological imbalance began then, of the male dominating the female, of men dominating other men, of one class dominating another, of one city dominating another, until the birth of the ancient empires and of the modern states. The typical characteristic of our original civilization right from the start was war. The history of the civilizations we're talking about is a whole history of wars, the organization of a collective aggression whose purpose was the subjugation or extermination of the other. Well, we must bear in mind closely that the crisis that we're now experiencing does not only concern the 20th century, industrial civilization, technocracy, but all these phenomena bring to dramatic and ambiguous fruition a much broader cycle of civilization. One could say that the whole history of humanity as we know it is being called into question nowadays. It's entering a critical phase. The modern civilization that we now criticize, but later on we will also see that we must criticize with discernment, is leading to extreme and very ambiguous consequences, an archaic and original form of humanity. Namely, it brings that civilization that begins with the Neolithic, with the dominion over nature, technical inventions, etc., and war. It takes them to its extreme possibilities thanks to the technological and political developments of modernity that have gradually, during the last 500 years, overwhelmed all other civilizations that we have encountered along the way, at least from 1500 onwards, thereby creating this current unified global empire. This is what we are experiencing. We should refresh our memory about the broad historical periods in which we find ourselves living. Second point, we must be careful. We must be careful because this awareness that it is an entire civilization, a 1,000-year-old one, that in modern times has entered into crisis, and one that is definitely characterized by war, by dominion over nature, by the things that Balducci said. We must be careful because this history of civilization is not only about negative factors. So over these thousands of years, there have been wars, massacres, male dominion over women. There has been all those things we heard, and that's true. But there also been a huge series of cultural and social developments, understandings that have continued in our modern age. In other words, we cannot throw the entire modern cycle into the bin as if it were entirely determined by factors of dominion or war. Do you understand? This is a temptation that is very common in these times. An anti-modern temptation, we could say, that risks becoming anti-historical. In the end, the whole of history is wrong. We refer to primordial eras, primitive people without knowing if they ever existed or what they were like, precisely because we have no trace of their writings. We must instead understand that all this is ambiguous. Let's take modernity, the last centuries. It's true that in recent centuries there has been colonialism. It is true there's been the progressive destruction of other civilizations that were defeated. Defeated not only because Western society was equipped with weapons, not only for this reason, not just because of this. To think that way is naive. No, there were thoughts and visions attached to that. There was an idea of humanity, of subjectivity, that was not achieved, but nonetheless was there. The last centuries were the centuries in which the West conquered the world, but they were also the centuries in which we conceived human rights. So, what I mean is that we must understand that the crisis we are experiencing brings to an end an ambiguous cycle, a profoundly destructive one, but also profoundly evolutionary one. This is very important to understand. We must understand, says Girard, very well, that Western civilization, which we are the first to criticize, is not one where we have many points of comparison. Namely, we often criticize our civilization on the basis of the values of our own civilization. We don't criticize it on the basis of other civilizations. The strongest criticisms of Western civilization were made by Westerns, Germans, English, French, Italians. Here, René Girard, to quickly summarize this point, but as you will see, it's very important. René Girard, who is probably the greatest living anthropologist, writes, "Our society abolished slavery and then enslavement. Later they began to protect children, women, the elderly, foreigners, and the marginalized. And the fight against poverty and underdevelopment got underway. More recently still, medical care has been extended to all, the protection of the disabled has increased, and so on." And then he says, "While the ancient societies were comparable to each other, similar and comparable, ours is truly unique. Its superiority in all fields is so overwhelming, so evident, that paradoxically it is forbidden to talk about it. To want to do this means a fear of returning to a despotic pride, of humiliating societies that are not part of the group of privileged nations. In other words, it is still the concern for victims that creates silence around itself. We invented the concept of ethnocentrism. It was the Westerners who began to say we must relativize ourselves. As Montaigne's chapter on cannibalism attests 5 or 6 centuries ago, in order to be capable of such an invention, then humans already had to be less ethnocentric than other cultures, concerned about themselves so exclusively that they did not even conceive of the notion of ethnocentrism. Do you understand me? What do I mean by that? I mean that when we say that Western civilization is in crisis, it's not because we're nostalgic for some other civilization. It is an entire cycle of human civilization that has reached a paradoxical stage. And what is this paradox? It's obvious. Namely, we've taken the evolutionary dimension as far as we can. Individual freedom, the rights of the individual, protection of the weak, medical care for all, right? All these things we have done, but at the same time, we have done them in a way that has reached the limit of sustainability. And we will see why. We are at a paradoxical stage. We are at a paradoxical stage that we need to understand better in order to be able to continue. The question is it possible to continue in the evolutionary direction of this civilization, namely more freedom, more knowledge, without the individualistic trend that led us to advertising society? Do you understand the question? This is the question. Is it possible to continue with our modern way of life, with its evolutionary side, more personal responsibility, more individual freedom, more personal rights, more identity and knowledge, without arriving at the individualistic trend of the advertising society? Third point. I believe that to move beyond this junction, to cross this paradox, we must ask radical questions about human beings, about ourselves. We must ask ourselves again in a deeper, freer way, what is the concept of being human? Who am I as a human? Who are we? And now, let me explain further in an extremely brief summary. Over the last 4 or 5 centuries, we have maximized the value of the individual and his or her freedoms. How did we do it? We have, let's say, valued the individual, progressively emancipating him from all the ancient bonds that previously, in a certain sense, constrained him. The bond with the earth, the bonds with his tribe, with nature. We freed the individual from the influence of the stars, from the divinities of the woods. Humans were terrified of nature. We freed the individual from these terrors of nature. We then freed him also from his ties with history, culture, religions, the ancient laws that were still experienced as a limit, the relationship with his ancestors, with the divinities, the bonds of blood. If you study modernity in this light, it has only done this. We've always given more value to the individual by freeing him from all these ties with nature and history. The political reflections of Hobbes, for example, or Locke, and the economic reflections of Adam Smith, as well as the scientific reflections of Newton and then Darwin. What have they taught us? They have taught us that we are free individuals who are essentially thrown into a ruthless competition. We need to really understand this link, the link between a certain scientific and philosophical vision that has been established especially since the 16th and 17th centuries, the link between this vision and the consequences that this vision has had on our lives, namely, if the universe is a random agglomeration of inert matter. As Swim said, if nature is nothing but this, a quantity of energy to be exploited, and we are nothing more than individuals thrown here by chance into a ruthless competition, then why shouldn't I be an individualist who thinks essentially of my own interests in a war of continual competition with everybody else and with everything. Why not? This is the world. Why should I be any different? Therefore, the radical individualism that then evolved into this consumerist desert that we all complain about has noble ancestors behind it, worldviews that legitimize this individualism and this behavior. This means that every cosmology, every vision of the world produces an anthropology, and every anthropology, namely every vision of man, who is man, then produces a sociology, an ethics system, a political system, a society. So this society produces a cosmology that considers nature an inert mass of random objects that relate to each other through actions of force made up of selfish atoms. There is even a what's his name, that contemporary scientist who actually talked about the selfish gene. Even the gene is selfish. It's all selfish. Why should I be different? Why should I have a passionate sense of community? My passion is to follow my own interests, my individual interests, and it's precisely in that way that I cooperate in the success of society, as Adam Smith would say. So, these last centuries have created a belief in man that we could sum up as follows. To have more freedom, you must be increasingly freed from any relationships, have no relationships. But unfortunately, if I am to have more freedom, I must at the same time be increasingly freed from any relationships, and this means that I also will become more and more foolish. Free to drink Pepsi Cola, free, totally, without ties, a puppet in the universe whose greatest satisfaction will be to consume a hot dog, Pepsi Cola, a cookie, and have my little smartphone. There it is. That's how the consumer is born in me. It's a long story, and that's not by chance. There is a vision of the world behind it, which is being continually promoted. So, fourth point. No, actually, I want to seal this third point with another brief reading. Readings that you will notice are all secular so that people don't think that this is spiritual reasoning without knowing then what one is talking about. This is in fact reasoning that any person who uses reason can share. So this extract that I now read to you is by Luc Ferry. Luc Ferry is a French philosopher who was also Minister of National Education, and he is totally secular. He writes, "In the name of absolute innovation, the 20th century has therefore annihilated, or at the very least has rendered deeply fragile any spiritual values. It is not a question of reflecting as a believer, but of reflecting about the whole of society whose values nowadays, as we have said, are essentially reduced to the market and to human rights. Values that are at most economic or moral ones, but are certainly not spiritual ones. Human rights are values, but they are not enough. They are not enough to create a sensible society. So here is the situation of our times at the end of this gigantic century of deconstruction, and it's for this reason we find it very difficult to grasp the principles of meaning, the spiritual values around which we could rebuild a collective project. Today's common moral values, those that were embodied in Kant's morality and in the ideology of human rights back in 1789, are summed up in the end by just one right: respect for others. Aging, however, has no link to human rights or respect for others. It's not a moral question. We can live as a lay saint or as a believer, respecting others in the most perfect way imaginable, but this will not prevent us from growing old. Another example, the loss of a loved one that probably for the majority of us is the crucial issue nowadays, for reasons which I will come back to later. The loss of a child who is killed in a road accident or a loved one who is victim of a serious illness. It's not a moral question, it's not an ethical question. Ethics is not enough. Legality is not enough to create a human society. Is that clear? It's not enough. If we believe this, we end up totally uncivilized, devoured, overwhelmed by the rights coming from the global marketplace. Devoured, overwhelmed by the rights coming from the global marketplace. That is only too happy to give us all the subjective rights we want. Look carefully, please, when you go home, look carefully at how the really rich people of the world think about human rights. They agree with all the policies of the major franchises, all of them. Bloomberg. Go and look at the huge foundations set up by American billionaires, all of them in droves, but who cares? Who cares? You want to get married, guys, girls, you make children using technology, but what the hell? Go ahead. Go ahead. Freedom. Freedom. What do they care? What difference does it make? Rights galore. It's all about the global market. We need spirituality to think about existential issues that are not reduced to the market or to human rights. Every man, whether he is a believer or not, as unfortunately is my case, a non-believer, as he said, needs to reflect on such questions not on morality or human rights, but on spirituality or on wisdom or meaning. Something that our democratic and liberal world definitely does not provide us with after a century of relentless deconstruction. Therefore, fourth transition. The last centuries of modernity have differentiated the human dimension, differentiated it, progressively reducing it to an individual atom. Individual and atom are synonyms, meaning they can't be divided. A lonely and despairing individual atom, lost in a supermarket. This process has produced a great evolution, as I've told you. It's not just a negative thing. Unfortunately or fortunately, in history as in life, things are ambiguous. We need discernment. We mustn't take modernity and throw it in the trash bin. We mustn't pull out our eyes and throw them in the trash. We must go forward. We mustn't go backwards. We must learn the lesson and move beyond it. Understand the limits of this process in order to make another project. The type of liberation process that has been carried out in the modernity of recent centuries through the differentiation of the individual from every previous link, and that led us to become lonely and desperate individuals, is over. This society no longer exists. It's no longer a civilization. It's collapsing. It's only a matter of time and of using our eyes. There are already those who see it, and they have seen it for some time. There are those who need to see it to realize it, but it's obvious. Remember Rifkin, even from an ecological, environmental, and economic point of view, the alarm bells are constant. They're obvious. Now, however, this means that we have extracted from this context. Each of us feels much more focused on ourselves, much more on I, an individual, compared to what happened 2, not to mention 10 generations ago. We are extremely selfie. Each selfie self each of us. And you take a photo of this, and you take a photo of that. You go to the cinema, and you take a photo, and you see the Pope, and you take a photo. But forget it. Who cares, and why do you care about seeing pictures of yourself everywhere? You're just a poor guy. We're all poor guys. We are passing figures, so why must we leave all these useless traces? Selfie. Do you understand? We are much more focused on ourselves, more than our ancestors were. And this is also a good thing. It's also a good thing. I don't mourn that. Let's be clear, you know it. I don't mourn that. I wouldn't have liked the time when everybody slept in one room. If you study the history of furniture, the history of beds, the history of sleeping in Europe over the last 300 years, bear in mind that it's only very recently that we have had our own rooms. Everybody slept in the same room, even kings, even nobles. There were no chairs. There were very few of them. We could say the chair, as we understand it, only developed from the Renaissance onwards. There were benches instead, as the chair is a very individual concept. As a result, we have developed this sense of self, of me, but we have developed it in a certain way, and now this clearly defined I, who takes so many selfies that appear on my Facebook profile, each one of us with our Facebook profile, right? Each of us with our own profile, each one of us is an author. This ever-present I, who is no longer tied to anything, is no longer tied to anything, is no longer tied to nature, is no longer tied to history, no longer marries. Have you read the latest statistics on marriage? They came out last week. The marriage rate has plummeted. No matter whether civil or religious, but especially religious, the rate is plummeting. We don't get married. We don't get hitched. Everyone wants their own little house, maybe only 20 square meters large, but their own place, alone, on their own, single. This I that is us must be us again in a new way. But I, this thing we call I, when you say I am Marco, what are you saying? I am Gustavo, but we don't know what we're saying. We absolutely don't know what we're saying. It's not clear, is it? Who am I? This I that finally became, in his view, full of rights. I have autonomy, autos, I, me. It's one and the same, but we must ask ourselves, am I really an atom, as Newton thought? Am I really an individual, as Locke thought? What does science say? Science tells us that it's not like that. Science tells us that the atom doesn't exist. Unfortunately, it is as if we still haven't understood the scientific revolutions of the 20th century. Science tells us that the very thing that Newton thought existed, namely the atom, actually doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, just as there is no individual, a separate I, a little box, independent, a machine. It doesn't exist. Let's read two sentences to refresh our memory, which are interesting because they come from the world of science. One is by Erwin Schrödinger, Nobel Prize winner for physics, one of the great fathers of contemporary physics, who writes, "However inconceivable it may seem to common sense, you and all the other sentient beings form an indivisible whole, far from being an atom, far from being an individual. We are now and always have been one whole, both physically and materially." He is not a mystic, is he? He could become a mystic, but no, this is physics. Another interesting quote is by Einstein. A human being is part of the whole called by us universe. A part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thought. You think you're separated from me, don't you? When I am distracted, I also think I am separated from you. Then I concentrate again, and I know that's not the case. And then he says, he experiences himself as separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. So what does this mean with respect to the somewhat complex reasoning we're doing? It means that the I, the individual, who has differentiated himself throughout this long history from the enslaving bonds of nature and history, do you understand me? Has freed himself from the enslaving bonds towards nature and history. Right now, today, he is called upon to recover the truth of these bonds in his freedom. This means that nowadays, precisely because we are individual, we are each a self, we can understand that we are interrelated. We're not at all isolated, we are not atoms at all, we're not separate individuals at all. And we can recover the truth of the great bonds from which we were freed, no longer in the form of of slavery, but with a free mind. What will it mean, for example, to live out freely and consciously our bond with nature? To know that nature is not separated from us. It is not an inert mass that I can exploit. The earth is not extraneous to me. If I gain awareness of the substantial bond with nature, do you understand me when I say substantial? The I is essentially terrestrial. The earth, fire, water, trees are basically part of us. If I acquire this new awareness, perhaps I will be more aware when I chuck the garbage out of the boat. Because I'll realize that if you pollute the sea, you are simply polluting yourself. And that pollution will sooner or later come back to you. Do you understand? Therefore, I believe that the I, let's say freed by modernity from the coercive bonds of nature and society, once released, is able to acquire a deeper awareness of who he is, and that is of his being radically interrelated. Relationship and in relation. Each human self is not an atom, as was commonly seen. As Einstein said, a materialistic, deterministic, atomistic, individualistic, and liberal illusion. Materialistic is basically an illusion. That's not what the I is like. The I, you, and I are not like this. We're not like that. We are human beings who have a vital relationship between ourselves and the whole and with the mystery of being. This is the human self, and today we can recover, or rather discover, this great awareness without viewing these bonds as slavery, as in the past. This is the great passage that Friedrich Capra also spoke about. I am not, and mankind A human being is not an atom separated from everything else and from the cosmic whole, simply because the atom does not exist, just as this form of I does not exist. It's an ideology. The I is not like that, I am not like that, but if I put the idea in my head that I'm like that, I shall reap the bitter consequences, those from which we started. I will build a world in the image of an optical illusion. I will build a world in the image of an I that claims to be separated, that claims to be free by separating itself from everyone else and thereby destroys itself. Fifth and final point, we can say this. Mine, my men's, my woman's, our achievement is not about freeing me from all ties with the earth, with the air, with history, with the mystery of the universe, to satisfy my increasingly ridiculous and childish desires. Instead, my achievement, the achievement of the human self, lies in freely living within these bonds. We have therefore rightly freed ourselves from the enslaving bonds of relationships as they were before we were identified in our freedom, but now we must continue on the path of autonomy, discovering, however, that this autos, I want to be autonomous, I want to be authentic. But who is this autos? Who is this self that lays down the law, autonomous of itself? Who is it? Your childish micro-ego, played like a spinning top by the market forces, a person totally without ties, with no more family, no more genealogy, born we don't know how or from which parents, a pinball in the hands of the masters of this world. Is this the self that will lay down the law to our world? The new autonomy, the new authenticity? Are we sure that this will be the right way to become myself again? Do we see this around us? Is this the way we are seeing more and more free and happy people with a sense of self-achievement? Or is the autos, namely my deepest self, profoundly more vast? Something that implies the totality of life and therefore all relationships. So my freedom doesn't come from relationships, but within relationships. In making myself aware of relationships and living them out within the effort of freedom. This is a new anthropology that opens up as a possibility. We could say at this point, and at this point perhaps you understand me, that we are rediscovering the religious nature of the relationship of human beings. The human being, the human self, is intrinsically about relationships. And here the term religion must be listened to again as if it were new in all its resonances. One of which is precisely about reconnecting between ourselves, reconnecting the bonds. We can't exist without bonds. We must see how we live within these bonds. The bonds with our parents can be the most castrating thing in the world, and psychoanalysis teaches us that we don't free ourselves in such way. We free ourselves from these ties by freeing ourselves from their negative effects. We get to the point of blessing our genealogy. And so we regain our freedom when we can bless our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors. And in this way we can rediscover our ancient traditions, but out of our own free will. We should return to value our ancestors, bless our grandparents, wait for the blessing of our great-grandparents. Without these, we're just pinballs. So, this autos that we want to achieve, our sense of self, is a spiritual world of living relationships that we must learn to experience. These relationships, in my opinion, we are illiterate, represent a new era that is opening up. We will have to learn to be human in this way, being human beings in the sense of reconnecting, rebinding, but also of rereading, choosing once more. We're becoming a humanity that no longer has a choice, no longer chooses anything, one which is always determined by external factors. A religious person, a person who has a strong relationship with the mystery of everything, is capable of reconnecting, also of saying yes or saying no. Because he is tied to something else, do you understand me? He has a vital connection to life. He doesn't care a bit about the powers of this world. He is in contact with very different powers, and he can therefore say yes and say no. Reconnect, but also reread, reinterpret history as we have done during this hour or so, very briefly, but it's really important. And if we don't do that, what are we talking about, guys? About having a passionate sense of community. But if we don't recount a largely secular story, I would say a millennial one, we risk simply making a journalistic speech. There's nothing at all wrong with that. It doesn't harm anybody, it doesn't affect anybody, okay? We have to ask ourselves why the city is breaking down. When it begins to break down the city as a figure of the human self, and what figure of self, and therefore what new forms of relationships, including civil ones, can we build? What kind of new relationships can we build if we develop this awareness of interrelation? What new revolution we can set in motion, and therefore a true passionate sense of community that means a new civilization, if we become active in this sense, and so maybe a new enthusiasm can be born. And finally, religions too. Religions, which is the opposite of negligence, the man who has a strong relationship with life, with mystery, with other people, with the substance of invisible things, because the substance of things is invisible. And also a lot, as they say, religions is careful, is not negligent. What he has to do, he does it, and he does it well, because he knows that what he does has an immense impact. I come here, and it's a real sweat, but I put everything I have into it. Whether it's a little or a lot, doesn't matter, but I put everything I have into it, because I know that if you don't do that, you won't be religions, you won't be doing your duty, and this will affect you. It's not moral. I don't know if it's clear. It's not moral. It's physical. It's a direct effect. If you don't work in a certain way because you're not aware of what you're doing, its impact will work against you. You'll be negligent and you'll pay the cost. The universe, all of this, is alive. It's not composed of dead atoms, as Newton thought. Science tells us it's all alive, it's all meticulously alive right here, you know? And it's all influenced by even the smallest of our thoughts and emotions. A minimum of interference impacts on everything. This is science. It is not mystical. It is mystical and science together is a new vision of the human self. It is this new vision that can really get us out of the deadlock in which we find ourselves. If we embrace this revolution of consciousness, we can continue along the path towards modernity in its evolutionary direction that is freedom, but with a better understanding of what freedom means, what it means to be human. Who is the human self? Who is the autos? Who rightly wants autonomy, authenticity? Who is this autos? How can I get in touch with my autos? Who is my autos? How can I get in touch with his thoughts in order to discover who am I? In my opinion, these are the burning questions, and to sum up, in my conclusion, the great turning point that overturns the atomistic individualism of modernity and therefore of consumer liberalism into which we're sinking in pure incivility. The greatest turning point is to understand that the more I am myself, the freer I am, the more I am related to others, which is freedom and love, which have always been seen in conflict, which means if the more I am myself, the more I must separate myself, free myself from all ties and live all alone in my quiet little hell with my Pepsi Cola, my cell phone, my iPad, iPod, iPad, everything I who? I who? I am a puppet in your hands. I am not there with my spiritual truth, do you understand? They play with us like puppets. I who? I live in New York. No way. The more I really am myself and therefore am free, and the more I discover I am related freely, lovingly with everything. This is freedom. Freedom and love essentially are not in conflict, and when they enter into conflict, that's because we are in a pathological structure that we must heal, and here begins a great new cycle of civilization. It's a great new cycle of civilization that is opening up. It will last for millennia, not century, millennia. It will take us millennia to understand how to be human beings who are more relational in our freedom, how to truly be ourselves, and therefore more correlated with nature, with other people, and with the mystery of being. That doesn't tower over us to overwhelm us, but towers over us in order to protect us, because without taking this broader view, we are just poor people abandoned in the middle of nowhere, and therefore in the hands of those who can easily deceive us. Turrell also described this very well, but instead I want to conclude poetically. Poetically, because in the 20th century there were a few poets who maintained a clear vision without sweetening in any way our history and its drama, whilst never ever losing sight of that bond, that perception that enables them always to see the evolutionary trends within this dramatic situation. These evolutionary trends are born from a very close observation of the difficulties without hiding them from us and not coming to tell us a lot of lies. Therefore, we must start from the fact that, according to a certain point of view, civilization no longer exists, or rather our civilization is in a terminal state. We must start from this point if we want to escape, otherwise, they will be telling us illusionary things, and these verses are by Dylan Thomas, a great poet of the 20th century, who wrote, "The closer that I move to death, one man, through his sundering hulks, the louder the sun blooms, and the tossed, ramshackling sea exalts, and every wave of the way and gale that I tackle, the whole world then, with more triumphant faith than ever was since the world was said, spins its morning of praise." Therefore, when we can once again learn how to praise, we will be able to build a new community, and our passion for this community will be overwhelming. Overwhelming.
Sì.
So now we will start our debate.
Iniziamo il dibattito.
So who wants to ask questions to Marco Guzzi, please? After this great speech,
Relazione iniziale di Marco Guzzi.
it seems to me that the things you said tonight in a very passionate and heartfelt way, all of us heard them, I believe, in a very empathic and heartfelt way, in short, but I'm wondering about this. Certain truths, especially concerning the relativization of human I, have always belonged to so many other cultures that our European anthropological anthropocentrism always discarded. It's as if we now, for the first time, discover the fact that half the world, we, the Greeks, have built our history on the individual self, settling on the atom of Democritus in Domus, while the other half of the world has built a completely opposite research that was based on we and not on the individual self. I'm also thinking of the Italian social psychology of Spaltro, the great transition from the I focus to the we focus. Now, as you said, it's very true. These must be rediscovered, a practical pedagogy of this transition from the I to the we must be recreated, because otherwise we can't get away from it. But what I think is nice about this modernity, since you rightly cited René Girard, when you create this discrimination, this difference between a neurotic ritual with our human history that's full of unheard rituals, let's say anachronistic rituals, or in the Freudian sense, neurotic rituals aggregative to the true construction of aggregative rituals that give meaning to cultures. This, I think, is today a big challenge. How can we do it? And I believe that, in conclusion, the concept of multi-ethnicity only can have a meaning like that to the extent that we can assemble our age-old and historical consciousness, to abandoning it. As you rightly said, the concept of human rights is born with the Enlightenment and the myth of Rousseau's wild men and all the limitations that they had, with a new practical policy that we can't take from our own culture, because it is this culture that has created all this mess. Instead, we must assemble with other cultures. And perhaps it's only in this way that we can create this new human being that you rightly began your speech by talking about. Thank you very much. Yes, I agree. In the meantime, I agree on the need to create aggregative policies. I believe very firmly in this. In my small way, I have basically devoted myself for 15 years now to the setting up and experimentation of groups that share the arduous process of the internal transformation that I was talking about. However, on a personal level, it's really complicated to achieve this, to recognize our innate form of subjectivity, our fears, our defenses, to work constantly on these limitations and constantly try to mitigate the sting, the automation. This is a very intensive, continuous task that I believe will become a kind of lubricant of the new civilization. This is already happening. There are many embryologies, research in this direction from many quarters. So, when we have better understanding of what I was saying, we will also understand that the personal process is not at all easy in the immediate future, because all of us too are essentially defensive, closed in, enthralled by the optical illusion Einstein speaks about. Therefore, by seeking to share the process of transformation, I think this is an embryo of a new interrelationship and therefore of a new civilization. So, how do we humans join together in this transformation? Well, if we actually can see this, ours is a society where it is becoming increasingly difficult to find a reason to gather together, a compelling reason for gathering together. We often regress. We regress to football. Even among people of my own age who are no longer exactly young kids, the only reason why we can still get together, but also among people like university professors, people from all walks of life, is for a football match. So there is this childish or tribal regression precisely because in the West the reasons in society for getting together were mainly religious or political ones, and these are all very much in crisis. I agree that we must, from that point of view, experience a relationship based on a transformation. The reason why we are friends is because we help each other in this task and create conscious groups that can then also express themselves at other levels, including political ones. I also very much agree, prospectively, that the encounter with certain great known Western traditions that in fact became a mass phenomenon in the second half of the 20th century, because before then there were certainly studies, there were poets, philosophers who knew Buddhism from Schopenhauer, even before. But it was an extremely elite phenomenon. We can say that after the mid-20th century, especially for certain phenomena, the knowledge of Asian traditions became widespread. Nowadays, more or less everybody, even a young boy, knows, if only by hearsay, a bit of Buddhism, a bit of yoga, a bit of Zen, a bit of Tao, Tai Chi, all these things, and in my opinion, this is not by chance. This meeting, since naturally I'm quite convinced of the hope that there is a sense to this world, that history has a sense, albeit a difficult one, I believe that it is providence. Namely, it is not by chance that this close comparison begins, this new dialogue with the Eastern traditions, in particular what I said, because they remind us of some things that had been a little lost on various levels. Therefore, a great dialogue on this begins. It has already begun, and we must carry it forward and try our best. It is a secular work, but undoubtedly, our modern Western civilization, having reached its terminal crisis on an individualistic, materialistic type, I say, the link must be understood. atomism, determinism, materialism, individualism, and mercantilism. We must have a clear understanding of this link. It is a struggle of ideas, it is a great struggle of the spirit that unfortunately is still not lightening up, but it will be light up. It will light up for sure. I do not know when, because the clouding over process is strong, the dehumanization is strong, and therefore the process of dumbing down are very strong. Violent, intelligent, and we are weak. There are no witnesses. There aren't any. As a result, there is also the need for new cultural aggregations of radical protest. These I very much believe in. Namely, we must create a culture that is currently lacking. It has been totally lacking for several decades throughout the West, but on the basis of truly new visions that challenge to its roots the theoretical, spiritual, and anthropological foundations of this world, supporting what I have sketched out, that its theoretical foundations are wrong. It is not true. We are not made like this. There is not just competition. There is no selective competition, not even the reality of nature, the only reality. All the ethological and more recently biological research on the life of animals tends to show that in nature there are at least two principles. One is certainly selection, etc., but there is also a great cooperation in nature and in ecosystems. It is absolutely necessary to rethink our vision of human beings. Otherwise, I repeat, the internal themes, such as a passionate sense of community, for example, I do not understand this, because all these passions for community need to be rethought, starting from an anthropological turning point. All these passions for community, but I would say the virtue, what is justice in fact? We're talking about a cardinal virtue, a secular virtue, an Aristotelian virtue. Therefore, justice, what does justice mean for a relational human being, for this new figure of human who discovers he or she is essentially a living interrelation with everything? What does justice mean? It means something different from the idea of justice that one can have on a moral, individualistic level, and so on. So, okay. Second question. You spoke to us about the optical illusion of conscience, and you also mentioned awareness. But what is this conscience? Where is it? What can we draw from where? What do we find? Where do we find it? What is it? Good. Good. That's right. In my opinion, we must start from here. When I said, but Capra also said, so in the quotation at the beginning of the evening, that we are faced with a cultural revolution that requires a radical rethinking of human nature. In the end, we are talking about the mystery of conscience. So, perhaps, even with respect to these problems that philosophy has faced up to with its tools, here too, perhaps we're facing a new transition. For example, to understand, are we sure that there is the consciousness rather than states of consciousness? You know, you wake up in the morning with your head spinning. Normally, you wake up like this. You wake up with everything wrong, don't you? You may have to do some things that you don't like, to meet people that you don't like. Isn't that so? You wake up badly. In that state of consciousness, you, like me, have a certain experience of the world. Everything seems bad, everything is heavy going. If in that state you were asked certain questions, you would answer in a certain way. If you asked yourself, but does it make sense to live? Instinctively, emotionally, you would say no. It's enough. You can't bear it anymore. It's a disaster, it's a bore. We all make this massive effort and then we all end up underground, In that state, I'm simplifying, but there is a disturbed state in which we find ourselves because we are, for example, irritated, and maybe you meet Cecchini and Cecchini tells you a thing that gets on your nerves. These things happen, right? A colleague who downgrades your work, the boss at your company who says that you did your job wrong or you have to do another job. Your mood is changed, your conscience actually changes, and you see the world in a certain way. Then maybe the question we should ask ourselves, apart from if we have to pay to have a bank account, those questions have changed. By instead asking those questions that they don't want us to ask ourselves, we should instead ask ourselves, what is consciousness? Right, let's put this question to one side. We might ask ourselves how I can work to stay in a state of consciousness where I am happier, because consciousness changes. So rather than asking me what is consciousness, which I repeat is perhaps a wrongly phrased question, this is philosophy, we might ask ourselves, why do I move from states of consciousness that are so different, some so pleasant and others so unpleasant? I want to stay in a more enlightened state of consciousness. How do I remain in a state of consciousness in which I perceive this opening that I spoke about? I don't feel like an animal closed inside this small body of 83, now 85 kilos, I must confess. Mostly made up of bacteria. It's disgusting to say so, but that's what it is. Yeah, plankton. That's it. What am I doing here? Don't I feel as though I'm condemned to death in a way? A kind of life imprisonment that also has an expiry date, as Rilke said, cooking in the lining of the coat? In another state of consciousness, I perceive something much more open that attracts me. What we call consciousness is as if it were a plastic organism. It changes. If you take it towards certain vibrations, it perceives other things. Therefore, rather than asking me what consciousness is, I'm more interested in knowing where consciousness is going if I take it more and more in an opening direction. What does life become if we are really all one? Won't our consciousness be the consciousness of this unity? The consciousness is yours, is mine, or in this moment is one. Aren't we all moving inside something that we can call consciousness, which is not only the thought, but also the matter? Because your liver at this time is doing a great job, huh? I guarantee you. Your liver as a consciousness, your heart as a thought. Even if we're currently unable to perceive it and interact, but maybe we can do so. And yes. So, my question. I think that we have to change the question. We have to get out of philosophy in a way. I got out of it very early. It is no longer a question of asking me what consciousness is. And whoever asks this question, consciousness cannot be objectified. We cannot ask ourselves this question, because anyway, it is consciousness that does it. And here, Hegel told, a bit of Hegel would do well, as you probably know. The first title he gave to the phenomenology of the spirit was not phenomenology of the spirit, but it was science of the experience of consciousness. So, he believed he could find a science, a full knowledge of how the experience of consciousness works. But in the end, he tells us that we are always inside this experience of consciousness, so you can't give an objective answer, as it were. It's an historical process in which the consciousness experiences itself, and we are in a phase in which the consciousness, the human self, can make a big quality leap in self-knowledge to better understand what consciousness is by living it, taking it on, adapting to that level, say, of vibrations higher than consciousness. Let's change our thoughts. In Greek, changing the mind is called metanoia, changing our mind. In order to proceed, let's say, in this knowledge.
Altre domande?
Here we enter into the initiatory theme that we have touched on many times, and that takes some time. What we have talked about, from my point of view, is an initiatory process, namely changing the states of consciousness or mind, working to widen our ordinary optical illusion, into which we're continually regressing, requires a process that in civilizations, in fact, is called initiatory, which simply means that it ends. The Greek term for initiation places the emphasis on the end and not on the beginning, but it's the same. In the initiatory process, it continually ends a way of being me, a mode of my consciousness, and opens up constantly again a wider possibility of being myself. This initiatory process is very dangerous. As the whole of the 20th century has shown us, because I see the 20th century both artistic, political, philosophical, psychoanalytic, as an often unconscious drama, unaware of this shift in the type of subjectivity. This passage in the great poets that interest me has often produced madness. That's why we must, as one of my lines says, be accompanied in the return. So here the big question arises about initiations, and therefore about initiatory traditions, and therefore about Christianity as a Western initiatory tradition, about the relationship between Christianity, which is the initiation of Christ, and the other initiations of other civilizations, because even Buddhism is an initiation, even Hinduism is an initiation. All these civilizations or traditions speak of the dying of a form of identity, of subjectivity, to be born to another configuration of the human. Therefore, in my view, we must now exit from the chaotic initiatory adolescence, where unfortunately there have been so many disasters, and understand that the initiatory process is a serious thing. Rely on the great traditions to understand the difference between the different initiations, choose one and follow it. A real one, not a made-up one, but a real one. After that, my creativity remains, but it is accompanied, guided, and finds a balance in the dialogical confrontation with a tradition that for centuries or millennia has learned the dangers and also passes on to us, let's say, methods. Third question. I would like to know this change of consciousness, of awareness, how it impacts on the economy, because at this time, together with this collapse of the current economic system, new forms are emerging. Experiments such as the gift economy, the economy of communion, and other forms. This is how it impacts on the economic level of new paradigms, if you like. As I already said, there are studies about this too. I believe that these studies are clearly not sufficient, and the change on the economic level requires. It will require very substantial changes of a political and a cultural nature. In the meantime, as you say, there are studies, experiments, there is a whole process. I know that there have also been economists who deal with this directly, with economic forms for the relational ego, namely economic forms that are no longer based on the anthropology of the Homo economicus of the 18th century or 19th century type, namely of the individual separated from all other people who pursues his own interest without caring either for nature or for other people or for the very meaning of life. So, there are these economic studies. There are Becchetti and Zavagni in Italy, and there are others. The economy of happiness, the new parameters of the wealth of nations overtaking GDP are things that if you know this world, you also know. That we use the gross domestic product, the GDP, as a parameter of a nation, right? And this is what everybody quarrels about, like all those on Ballarò, all these TV programs in Italy, all the nightmares, Ballarò 1, Ballarò 2, on all the other channels, and it's all the same, and they are all the same, and they all argue about the 0.2, 0.3 percentage of GDP. However, the more intelligent economists are now questioning this parameter because this GDP figure also includes wars, floods, and weapons for killing people. All these make up the GDP. So maybe we have to create new economic parameters to evaluate the wealth of a nation, right? For example, the wealth of its relationships included in the economy, just as someone said, I don't remember who, maybe Goethe, no, who is that said that economy is a set science? Well, it is a set science. The economy is a science of set passions, isn't it? You have to include other points of view within this vision, and therefore the economy of happiness is a paradox. If you think about it, the economy will not solve the problems of the economy. No, it's not up to the economy to do this, but the economy itself must start from a new anthropology. In my opinion, when economists broaden their minds, they will be the first to understand what it means to be a relational ego, and they will begin, as is already happening, to think about relational ego economy potentially on a global level. For this reason, what we do here in Italy is no longer also economically separate from what happens throughout Europe and also throughout the world, and not only for purely ecological, environmental reasons, but also for economic and production reasons. We're suffering from the catastrophic effects of an individualistic, mechanistic, and materialistic view of the economy. Think about the whole phenomenon of the relocation of industry. They are all the result of a crummy vision of mankind, a distorted vision. I mean, it's wrong. We're not made in that way, and if we carry on in this direction, we'll destroy ourselves. It is also from this stage that the new economy must be created. It must be created from a new anthropological vision, from a complete cultural revolution, a complete revolution that is totally without precedents, compared to the totalitarian and ideological revolutions of the 20th century, or of the national and Renaissance revolutions of the 19th century. It's something new and much more radical, much more radical. This new economy needs a change of humanity.